Now, this may surprise you to learn, but I'm a woman in her 70s who has been listening to your show on the internet for many years. My lovely grandson played your show, and he says it's a podcast, but they'll forever be radio shows to me. In the car on a family trip one day, and 3 hours later, I was hooked on your voice, your stories, and your excellent delivery. Now, recently, I asked my grandson if you're married, just out of curiosity, and he said you're not. And jokingly, I said that if I was 50 years younger, maybe I'd email you and ask you for a date. My grandson remarked that this would make for a pretty exciting story for your channel, that you got catfished by a very old lady, and then he started to explain what catfishing was. Now, I stopped him and said, "Kiddo, I know what catfishing is. I was a catfish a few years ago when we were in school." And his jaw just about hit the floor. He's 20 now, but when he was in school, I was around 70 years old, and he had no idea that I'd been the victim of catfishing. Neither did my son, his father, because frankly, it's a little embarrassing. But my grandson, Damie, he'd begged me to tell him the story of what had happened, and then when he was done, he begged me to let me help him write it down so he could send it over to our favorite podcaster. And I told him that I was perfectly capable of writing my own emails, thank you very much, but I think he just wanted a reason to email you, so if you do read this out on your show, please can you say hello to my grandson Damie, short for Damien, and tell him Joel from Let's Read wants him to know that Granny loves him very much. Now, all that said, let me tell you about my creepy experience. So my husband, Vic, tragically died in the 90s in a very violent incident, but he always told me that if anything were to happen to him before me, then I had to promise to at least try and find someone else to make me happy in my final days. Well, I didn't really want to because Vic was the only man for me. But then when I was using my computer that Damie had insisted that I get, I kept receiving these pop-ups and ads and spam for dating services. Hot singles in your area, my fanny. I know a scam when I see one, but it did get me curious. Now this would be around maybe back in 2017, I think. So dating sites were actually pretty normal then, and I think people were even using those apps like Tinder, but I decided to go for a classic. They showed me Bumble because I liked the name and I thought that it was cute. And the gentleman that I met on there was a real silver fox, named Nate, and I knew Vic would have approved of him. He seemed like a real gentleman. I could go into detail explaining all the wonderful things that Nate said about himself and what a great fellow he was, but as you know, this is a catfishing story, so it was all lies. Now, I arranged for a lunch date in Kensington because old dears like me prefer to be tucked into bed by 8, so I met him at this lovely open-air cafe that I frequented sometimes. Now, the man sat down opposite me clearly was Nate. I could recognize the facial features and the jawline, and he was most certainly a very attractive man. The problem was, he looked about 23 years old. And I can be exact because he actually later told me this. Now, I remember that Damie had shown me a computer game on his telephone one day where he took a picture of himself and made himself look old, and he'd looked just like Vic. He then took a picture of me and made me look young, and I looked just like me from my glory days. That's when I figured my date had done, taken a photograph of himself with that same game or app and then used it as his profile picture. And I just stared at him, and immediately my mind went to all those scams that you read about. Now, my dear friend Ethel had fallen for some of those some time ago, and you often heard about old widows and spinsters being seduced by young men in order to secure their vast fortunes. Now, surely this couldn't be happening to little old me. I stared at Nate and sipped my cup of coffee and said nothing, and he just gave me this sort of weird smile and said that he wasn't quite what I was expecting, huh? I said no, he was not, and I was very old and didn't have the patience for these sort of strange games, and please could he explain exactly what was going on before I left. Now he gave me another grin, and I recognized this as trying to be seductive. Then he asked if I would have agreed to meet him if he knew he was 23. I said no, honestly I wouldn't, and he responds with, "Well, there you go then," as if that explained anything. So I asked why exactly he wanted to meet me in the first place, and he said, "Wasn't it obvious? I was smoking hot, and he was into women like me. Like really, really into women like me." I asked what he meant by women like me, and he winked and grinned and said that he meant senior. Because weren't women like me always more expert, more seasoned, more willing to push boundaries? He then proceeded to say some much more vile stuff that would have made me blush if I'd been less of a prude. And I most certainly was not flattered, though. The way that I saw it, a man pretending to be 50 years older than he is to catfish an old widow is no less deceptive than those weird men who pretend to be in their 20s and show up for dates looking very obviously like they're in their 50s. Deception is deception, Vic always used to say. Now, this man, Nate, was now suggesting that it would be an honor for me to have a night of passion with him, and he'd show me things that he was sure my old deceased husband would never have dared to show me. Now, this got my blood boiling. Nobody spoke bad of Vic. Nobody. Nate was just lucky that Damie or my son weren't here, or things would have gone a lot worse for him. I stood up, knocking my teacup over and spilling the lukewarm tea onto Nate's lap. He didn't like this one bit, and he jumped up calling me some old fool and saying that my dementia was preventing me from accepting the best night of my life. Now, I snappily told him that he should not speak to a woman like this, whether women of his age or elderly women or men for that matter. Also, that catfishing and deceiving elderly widows typically does not lend itself to seduction and makes him appear very suspicious. Nate just snorted, looked at me up and down with a very strong sneer, and told me that I clearly wasn't some rich widower, and he wasn't interested in stealing my pension or my Mills and Boone collection. He said he was put on this earth to give sad, dried-up old dears like me one final night of passion. And then he said the most chilling thing yet. He leaned over the table and hissed at me that his dream, his fantasy, was to cause a fatal heart attack with the power of his lovemaking. Other people were starting to look at us now. We'd been the only people sitting outside, but a few folks had exited the cafe while this was going on, and the other passerbys had become concerned about what they saw. From their perspective, a sweet old granny was being threatened by a young man, which I suppose was exactly what was happening. Little did this Nate realize either that a woman had walked up behind him just as he'd launched into his twisted confession about his fantasy of his manhood ending an elderly woman's life. And the passerby did not like this one bit, I assume, because she swung her purse at him and hit him straight in the side of the head, with no warning and absolutely no announcement. He whirls around and starts screaming at this woman, saying she's assaulted him, and that it was a very rude word beginning with a W, and a woman who teases male chickens, and that I'd let him on. Of course, people did not believe this story coming from this predatory-looking young man compared to the sweet old lady who was insisting that no, absolutely not, and in fact he'd catfished her, and maybe even wanted to steal her pension. A handful of people began shoving him, telling him to jog on, my old son, or he'd be meeting the Lord a lot quicker than this old dear would. I appreciated the intervention. It was the first time that men have fought on my behalf since before Vic passed, and it almost felt like old times. So much so that I didn't even stop to think when Nate just fled like a coward. Maybe I should have had him arrested or something. Was it even a crime to pretend to be older on Bumble? And when I got a cab home that afternoon, I checked the website, and that buffoon hadn't even deleted his profile. Instead, he sent me a message calling me a slur and an old hag, and that he'd send me a picture of his genitals, with it saying, "This is what you're missing," if he could. And since you'll be reading this in audio, Mr. Joel, please point out to your listeners that he spelled it as Y-O-U-R. Now, I screenshotted Nate's profile and the message that he sent me and forwarded them to Bumble Trust and Safety. Now, anyways, to end this story, I called Damie and told him the whole sordid tale, and he was fuming, of course, but also a little bit amused. After all, Nate didn't actually know who he'd been trying to seduce. Vic had his faults, and there were many times that I didn't condone his activities. But my dear departed husband was a fairly high-up enforcer in a certain crime family here who will remain nameless. Sadly, even though Vic had given up the life came catching up to him in the 90s, and he was sadly caught in the crossfire of an event that didn't even involve him. But he'd left me a very, very tidy nest egg, and I am exactly the kind of person that predators like Nate will normally target. It took every ounce of my stern granny energy to absolutely forbid Damie from tracking Nate down and teaching him a lesson he'd never forget. And I'm pretty sure that being made to look like a fool by a woman in her 70s and having his stuff reported to Bumble was punishment enough. Maybe. Now thank you for reading, Mr. Joel, and maybe one day I'll share some stories with you about some of my more wild times in the 70s when Vic was still alive. But for now, good night and God bless. It's nearly 8 p.m. and it's time for this old dear to retire to bed. So I noticed that you don't get many submissions from trans people, so I thought that I'd send the story that happened to me recently about the time that I was catfished on a dating app. So to clarify, I'm a lesbian trans woman and I use an LGBTQ plus dating app that I won't name because it's still fairly low-key and hasn't been swarmed by the usual bigots trying to ruin it for us yet, but it's also not aimed at, let's just say, blue sky type LGBTQ plus people. And I do not mean this derogatorily, but it's for us older gays who lived through New York in the 80s, those kind of folks. Bisexual boomers, late-game lesbians, whatever you want to call us, and we kind of like to keep it that way. So I'm in my mid-40s, and honestly, I just want to quietly live my life as the gender that I identify as. I spent years consulting with doctors and doing the whole psychiatric assessment business, making sure it was the right decision for me, and I feel that it was, and I've never been happier with who I am. Now, not to preach, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, but as an older trans woman, I really do want to add this note for anyone listening. Please, please, please be 100% sure you're fully aware, educated, and ready for what you're getting yourself into before you begin that process. This view makes me a little unpopular with the kids, but I promise you, you will live a happier and healthier life, even if it feels like you're having to leap through hoops early on. The world sucks for us right now. Make sure that you're fully sure that you want to commit to that fight, and my heart goes out to anyone going on the same journey I did, especially as a young person in today's climate for a bunch of reasons. And the story is kind of a cautionary tale about the kind of things trans women face, I guess. It's something I've dealt with all my life, but it was worse when I was younger. So back to the app, I matched with this other trans woman who claimed to be in her 30s. She looked a tiny bit familiar in her photos, so I wondered if I'd seen her on the app before. She also certainly looked closer to my age, but hey, some of us lived hard. And reading her profile, she seemed like a good match and a fun time, so I messaged her. We exchanged a few messages and then agreed to an evening meal at a small bistro in the village. When I arrived, the maitre d' guided me to my usual table. Yeah, I'm the type of person to have a usual table at a gay bistro, and I sat and had a glass of wine while I waited for my date, Charlene. Now, the person who eventually sat opposite me was a very masculine-looking person in their 50s, wearing a casual shirt and tie. They certainly weren't trying to pass as a trans woman, but hey, fair enough. Maybe I misunderstood that they were a drag queen. If so, they'd be disappointed, and I'm only into women of any sort, not men who just masquerade as women, even though I'm cool with that, so I asked him, "Hey, are you Charlene?" And he says no, he's actually Charlene's dad, strongly emphasizes he's straight for some reason, and says he found out that his daughter had a date with me and wanted to check me out first because he's really protective and doesn't want his daughter being hurt because she's vulnerable because she's trans, as if I'm not. Now, naturally, this is all very suspicious to me, and I'm starting to definitely think that I've seen this guy before. One, I am absolutely certain that this man was Charlene, but hey, if Charlene is his daughter, then there could be a resemblance. Two, I'm also absolutely certain that I've seen him hanging awkwardly around some of the bars that I frequent in the village, which, let's just say, aren't typical for straight dads. So this guy says his name is Charles, another red flag. Charles and Charlene, and that he's sorry for the deception, but would I mind spending the evening with him so he could tell Charlene whether I'm safe to go on a date with? I should have said no right there because already I was starting to understand exactly what kind of a catfish situation I was experiencing here. Now, I'm a cocky B-word who loves a free meal and a free drink, so I tell him sure, I'll hang out with him as long as he's paying. And he says, of course, a fine lady like myself should never have to go Dutch. Fair enough. And so we get talking for a while, and it becomes very clear that he's interested in me. Charles seems to forget that he even had a daughter called Charlene as soon as the food arrived. He was just interested in me, and in particular, interested in asking if I'd had the surgery. Yes. And weird things like, did this mean that I was biologically a woman now? Did I get a womb surgically implanted? All sorts of very strange questions. Bear in mind that this was just before the pandemic too, so it's not like this happened during a time when finding info about how this all worked was super hard. And I told him some of these questions were things that he should maybe research himself or ask Charlene. And by then, we finished dinner, and goddamn, this guy was so apologetic. Like, I felt really bad for him. And then he starts doing this thing that some guys do when they try to overcompensate. Like, I wish I was trans myself. I feel spiritually trans, and I would have voted for trans Obama if I could. Okay, he didn't say that last one, but it was almost as cringy as that. And I decided enough was enough, and I looked him right in the eye and said, "There's no Charlene, is there?" He didn't reply for a moment, so I continued, asking if he simply wanted to go on a date with me. And he kind of nodded shyly and said that he was into me, but he knew I was only into women, so he posed as a trans woman on the dating app. I try to be as gentle as possible here. I tell him there's nothing wrong with a straight guy wanting to date a trans woman, but there is something wrong with catfishing people and pretending to be a woman when you're not. He countered this by saying that in my profile, I said that I was happy to date trans women with or without the surgery. And I'm like, yes, women, I'm a lesbian. And he could not grasp that it made any difference. And eventually I just said that none of this was important. The important part was that he'd fully posed as someone else on a dating app, made up a trans daughter, and catfished me, and surely he saw that that was bad and kind of scary. Now, he looked almost frustrated, and really thought that this might go okay. But then he asked, and would I maybe at least try spending the night with him? Maybe I'd feel different, and he really did mean it when he said that he had a transgender soul, and that it didn't matter that I'd had the surgery. I try and be as gentle as possible. I tell him there's nothing wrong with a straight guy wanting to date a trans woman, but there is something wrong with catfishing people and pretending to be a woman when you're not. He countered this by saying that in my profile, I said I was happy to date trans women with or without the surgery. And I'm like, yes, women, I'm a lesbian. He could not grasp that it made a difference, and eventually I just said that none of this was important. The important part was that he'd fully posed as someone else on a dating app, made up a trans daughter, and catfished me. And surely he saw that that was bad and kind of scary. Now he looked angry, and I really thought that this might go okay, but then he asked, would I maybe just try spending the night with him? Maybe I'd feel different, and he really did mean it when he said that he had a transgender soul, and that it didn't even matter that I'd had the surgery. And that's when I realized that he was a full-on chaser. Typically someone who convinces themselves they're straight, but fetishizes and tries to hook up with pre-op trans women. Usually they prey on much younger people than myself, but I guess Charlie was into older people too. And I told him, hey, why don't you just set your profile up on the app so you're not pretending to be your own trans daughter, but just list yourself as bisexual and looking for men and women? Well, good God, was that a mistake? Are you calling me an F-slur? Charlie screamed, leaping up from the table and throwing the table to one side, sending the remains of our wine flying into the food of our neighboring diners. I jumped back like, whoa, this guy's gone from 1 to 1,000 real quick. And then I notice he's holding a fork and coming right at me. He's screeching about how dare I call him an F-slur, and that he's loudly accusing me of catfishing him, saying I pretended to be a man to get him to come on a date. Little does he know that most of the people in the bistro right now actually know me, so for one thing, that's laughable. Two, while backing away from his jabbing fork, I ask him how that makes sense because he's a straight man. How could I have catfished him in that manner? And he just starts jabbering on, and when he doesn't have an answer, this lunatic just jumps at me with his fork, trying to stab me in the face with this piece of cutlery. And one of the other diners that night was the nicest, most gentle mid-50s gay guy that you could ever meet. And he was also a hardcore biker, sort of leather daddy, and a former Marine. So when he stood up and got between me and Charles, I knew it was over for him. My buddy, who will remain nameless because technically he did commit a crime here, grabs Charles' wrist holding the fork and puts enough pressure on it that I'm sure he snapped a bone or two. And then he hits him with a punch in the gut that would have winded King Kong. Charlie goes flying backwards, crashing into another table, upending someone's food all over the damn place, so now he's got this 20s gay guy and his lesbian best friend mad at him too, and everyone's screaming at this Charles guy, calling him a chaser and a catfish and a creep and God knows what. And then suddenly, everything went silent. And that guy in his 20s who just had his food knocked over, who I vaguely knew, said the most damning, scathing, violent thing of the night. "Honey," he said to Charles, in the most stereotypical camp gay hairdresser voice you've ever heard, which was not even how he talked at all. "Honey," he says, "you've got some balls on you to come on a date in the village in an outfit that Dwight from The Office would be ashamed of." Charlie was still reeling from the punch by Leather Daddy, but this was the killing blow, essentially. And he glared at us all with the most murderous look, and then, I'll never forget, he yelled the most out-of-pocket, bizarre thing I think I've ever heard anyone say. I hope Al Gore sends you all back to England." And then he ran out of the restaurant. Now we're all too stunned to follow for a moment, and then a group of us went running after him, only to see a car peeling out of the parking lot. Sadly, none of us got his license plate, but it turns out that a lot of cameras did, so he eventually got taken to court by the bistro owner and forced to pay for damages. And we kind of downplayed some of the events, though, but just so the one guy didn't face any assault charges, and thankfully Charles kept quiet about that. And the night this all happened, I went back home, all catfished out, and went to block Charlene Charles on the app. And unsurprisingly, the profile was already gone. Anyways, be careful out there, my fellow Alphabet Army. There are some incredibly weird people in our community, especially the ones who aren't quite willing to admit that they're actually part of the community. We have enough danger from the outside, so let's try and be nice to each other within, you know? Especially, don't tell people that you hope Al Gore sends them back to England. We all agreed that that one really stung. This story happened to my aunt back when she was in her 40s. This was around 1998. Webcams weren't a thing that many people had back then, and people like my beloved aunt, who was always pretty technologically savvy, used to use IRC chat rooms and these AOL chat rooms you'd have access to by being an American Online customer. Now, I'm not sure exactly how she met this guy. She just says a chat room and can't remember further details. The guy claimed to be a pretty successful author, and my aunt's always been attracted to literary intelligence, so they struck up some type of friendship. And she kept pushing him to tell him some of the things he'd written, though, and he wouldn't. And he sort of playfully refused and promised her that one day he'd tell her the truth, but not yet. Eventually, a budding online romance developed between the two of them, and this was back in the days before meeting romantic partners online was remotely advisable, so she knew that she was taking a pretty big risk. She lived in Toronto and he lived in Nashville, and they were talking about her flying out to meet him. She gave him crap again, saying how could she prove that he was who he said he was? And he had sent a few scans of some photos, but they didn't look like any famous authors that she knew, and besides, he said, nobody knew what he supposedly looked like as an author, which wasn't too uncommon back then before social media. What he did send her, though, was redacted scans of his bank account, which she swears to this day appear to be legitimate. He certainly had money, and whether it came from being an author or not was another matter, but that part didn't seem to be a lie. Nor was it a lie when she received a plane ticket in the mail, paid for in his real name, as well as a deposit sent to her bank account for travel expenses. He told my aunt he genuinely loved her and wanted to be with her, and she believed him and felt the same. So my aunt was all set up to fly out to Nashville, at the airport, ready and excited, when suddenly an unexpected flash storm hit. It delayed the flight by an entire day, and she was extremely stressed because she needed to get this information to her man. And we should probably give him a name, actually, so I guess I'll just call him Alan because that's what he said his name actually was. Now, eventually, things were arranged that my aunt was given accommodation in a hotel overnight, and from there, she tried to call Alan on the landline that she had for him, but nobody was picking up. It made sense because right about now her plane should have been landing, and he would have been there to meet her at the airport. She could only hope that the airport itself would inform people that the flight from Toronto to Nashville had been delayed and would be landing the following afternoon. She left a message on his answering machine, but since she was still calling from a hotel room landline, she had no idea what number to give him to call her back. He didn't call back, but she took the flight anyway and hoped that he'd be there when she landed. Needless to say, there was no sign of Alan, and she waited around for a while hoping he'd show up, but he didn't. Thankfully, my aunt did have an address for him, and it wasn't a cheap cab ride, but she took it. His house was pretty modest, a single-story building that didn't really give away the fact that the owner was rich, this successful author, but it didn't really rule it out either. My aunt tried knocking, looking through the window, looking for a spare key or anything, and eventually an elderly neighbor came out and asked her what the heck she was up to. Now my aunt kind of broke down crying and told them everything. The elderly neighbor was kind of weird about it, which you can't blame her for, but when my aunt showed her the photo of Alan that she had, which she'd mailed her, in the actual mail back then, the 90s were wild, the neighbor confirmed that that was the man who lived in the house. However, his name wasn't Alan. That didn't necessarily prove anything. People do use different names, so my aunt asked the neighbor lady about whether this guy was an author, and my aunt says that she clearly started to say yes, but then backed down and changed her mind and said no. No, he worked some job that she didn't know about. My aunt decided to stay in a hotel on her own dime for a few more days, calling Alan repeatedly, and eventually his answering machine said it was full and she couldn't leave any further messages. Now, heartbroken, my aunt returned to Canada. Thankfully, she was able to get her return ticket shifted to earlier, and she never heard from Alan again. Now, I grew up hearing the story. I'd been a little kid when it happened, and just knew that my aunt had found someone, and then later that things had just gone wrong. Mom told me some very brief variants of it over the years, but eventually in the mid-2000s, my aunt cornered me at a Thanksgiving dinner and told me that she wanted to share the whole story because she knew that I was into mysteries and true crime and things like that, and something had never sat right with her about the whole thing. So the story I've just told you is the story she told me, and it really did sound like she'd been catfished. But the thing that really stuck with me was why? What did Alan have to gain from this aside from just cruelty? And maybe it was just my aunt's unwillingness to hate this guy, but it really didn't sound like he was out to hurt her, at least not in the way he did. Now, I did some digging, even though I didn't have much to go on. An author who disappeared on a certain date, whose name may or may not have been Alan, but wasn't the name that he published under. I got it in my head that the guy hadn't catfished my aunt, but something else had gone on instead, so I was searching for authors who died around that time, and nothing really came up. Then, on just some stroke of genius, I asked my aunt if she still had the address for Alan. A few weeks later, she managed to dig it up from some printout of an email that she'd kept from all the way back then, believe it or not, and I looked up the address itself and the past owners. It had been owned by a man named David, then the next name, and the next owner had the same name, and a Google search suggested that it was his son. So I looked up David and that name, and there wasn't much in the way of information for him back in the 90s. But then I get drawn down this rabbit hole on a sadly now defunct message board about conspiracies and missing people. The thread had flagged up in my search for his name, but I didn't immediately see how it was relevant. It was a thread about a female romance mystery author locally published in the area of Nashville that Allen lived. The thread had started out with the OP asking if anyone remembered these books. There were about 5 or 6 of them, and they were typical Harlequin-style romances, but the OP remembered them having passages that read almost as if it was in some kind of code, like strange, unusual sections that didn't seem to fit with the rest of the otherwise generic romance novel. I read more and more of the thread, and that's when David Allen's name came up. The female romance author, J.A. Len, seemed to be self-published back in the days when self-publishing was extremely costly and hard, and her book was a staple at local fairs, and craft events, and bookstores, but all of the stalls were manned by someone claiming to be the author's brother, David Allen, and then the name. As the thread went on, these sleuths began to dig further and discover that David Allen name was spelled Allen like A-L-L-E-N, which allowed them to discover that on the afternoon my aunt was flying into Nashville, a man named David Allen name had gone off the road on a cliff-top path and crashed through the guardrail, dying instantly. And so I'm just there thinking, holy crap, my aunt didn't get catfished. Her lover tragically died on the way to meet her. But then the post continued. A few posters swore down that their relatives had eloped with a guy named David Allen Blank who lived in Nashville. All of them had cut off their friends and family and claimed that they were living with David Allen on a commune of sorts, a commune nobody could actually prove even existed. So now we have David Allen Blank meeting multiple women on the internet throughout the 90s, paying to get them to fly to Nashville, and then they all mysteriously disappeared. Some of the posters even had proof of missing person reports, which they posted scans of. And then one final post really chilled me to the bone. They'd claimed that they used to work for the Nashville County Sheriff's Office, and that they'd get in a lot of trouble for posting these recordings. But this was the tape taken from David Allen's answering machine after his death. I listened to it all. There were multiple messages from my aunt on there, along with a couple from 2 other women who seemed to be in some kind of early-stage relationship with David. But the most chilling one was the message received just before the final 2 messages from my aunt, in which she desperately tried to explain that her flight had been delayed by a day. It was a male voice, saying that David Allen had let them down one too many times, that the goods had been scheduled to arrive in Nashville that day, and a lot of effort had been made to ensure everything was running smoothly. David Allen apparently should have booked a different flight route for the goods to ensure that there were no weather delays. I thought about posting, saying the other messages were from my aunt. I thought about telling her. I had no idea what to do. Now, I saved that file and ultimately decided to just selectively take bits of the information. So to this day, my aunt believes that Allen, David Allen, tragically met his death while driving to the airport to meet her. It was a tale of doomed love, and it gave her closure. But there's so much that doesn't make sense to me. Romance has always been a lucrative genre, but a self-published romance author wouldn't be making the kind of money in the 90s that my aunt claimed was on Allen's bank statements. Okay, maybe she got it wrong, but what about the weird coded paragraphs that a handful of the posters recall being in the books? And why were there no images of the books themselves? It didn't sound like they'd been widely in circulation. Only about 3 members of the weird lost media conspiracy forum that I'd found had ever even read them, and they'd all grown up in 90s Nashville. I wish I'd posted on the forum or made at least 1 or 2 connections there, because the place got shut down while I was still trying to decide what exactly to do. And it had nothing to do with David Allen. There was some other drama about how a much more severe, sensitive political topic that caused the forum to implode, and the hosting providers themselves just decided to delete it. And the admin posted a notice saying that they no longer felt safe running the forum, and that was that. But here's what I think. My aunt was catfished, but not in a way that she first suspected. David Allen was involved in some kind of human trafficking or maybe a cult program where he'd lure certain women across the country based on criteria that I can't quite work out by pretending to be a successful author. Now, he was certainly an author and certainly rich, but so much about his identity was fake. And what happened to the other women who supposedly eloped with him? They all told their families on the telephone that they wanted no further contact with them. And back then, these things really didn't get looked into that hard. But I'm certain that David Allen was not the doomed romance author that I let my aunt believe, and that whatever catfish scheme he had planned for her, it was a lot more sinister than simply luring her to Nashville and breaking her heart. I just wish that I knew the truth of what it was. Bit of a weird one for you here, but a few years ago, I ran a small Discord for a bunch of friends who watched me on Twitch or hung out in other ways. Now, I'm sharing this next part because it's very relevant to the story. I'm what's known as an ace arrow, or arrow ace, or whatever, as in biologically I've experienced no romantic attraction whatsoever. As a woman, this is kind of handy to be able to tell people in an online community because you know what some Discord guys can be like. And if I introduce myself as not even the slightest possibility, I found it to become a little easier to avoid those situations. Not totally, but to a point. And then came a certain member of the community who we'll just call Rustin. He sort of lurked around mostly, adding his thoughts on things here and there, asking if he could join us for group gaming nights sometimes, which he did, although he didn't have a microphone. One day, out of the blue, I received a huge DM from him, like thousands of words long. So at first I'm thinking, okay, I know exactly what's coming, should I even bother to read this? But I did, and yes, it was exactly what I expected. A weird and unwarranted confession of love. Normally, I'd be sympathetic towards these types of things. It's not other people's faults that I'm ace arrow and have about as much interest in physical contact with another person as I do with a meat grinder. Now, I try and be really nice about it, even though I'm very open and upfront publicly that I'm not looking and never will be looking. And the heart wants what the heart wants, though. However, Rustin's logic wasn't just that he had a crush on me. He said we were soulmates. We were destined to be together. Things could definitely work between us, and he knew because we had the same niche, specific tastes in things that indicated that we were soulmates. Now, I won't bore you with all of them, but some of the funnier ones were that we both played the X-Files FMV game on PlayStation 1 as kids, and then later the X-Files Resist or Serve on PlayStation 2. But even bigger proof that we were destined to be together, we had both played obscure survival horror games such as Ghost Vibration on PS2. Sure, buddy, I get that not many people have played that game because it was crap and the main character looks like a cross between Howdy Doody and Tommy Taffy, if you know you know, but that did not mean that we were soulmates. But then came the kicker. We had both played the very original Blair Witch Project game on PC, the one that connected to the Nocturne universe. If this is sounding incredibly nerdy, well, that's because it is. I'm a horror fan and a horror game developer. A friend of mine in the same field is part of the Let's Read community and encouraged me to send the story over, in fact. So it's kind of my job to play these things. So yeah, okay, these were some pretty strange coincidences that we'd played and enjoyed those 4 obscure games, but that obviously did not mean that we were soulmates or that somehow being with Rustin could cure me of the fact that I am not biologically or romantically attracted to people. Like, I'm not talking not that interested or rarely in the mood. I mean, I am not. No amount of X-Files FMV games is going to change that. But then the message got even more insane. He told me that despite all of this, he knew that we couldn't be together because he'd heard me on stream laughing at jokes made by another member of the community, and he could tell that we were in love. He said that he had a sixth sense for these things, and he knew that me and this other guy had something going on, and he didn't want to get in the way of that. The reason he was telling me all of this was to apologize in advance if he seemed moody or angry with me going forward. One, the guy he was talking about was my effing brother, Alex, who guested on my streams a couple of times. So yeah, good sixth sense, buddy. I guess Rustin hadn't been logged on or conveniently ignored the multiple times that we mentioned that Alex was my sibling, or maybe he thought because we're adopted siblings that didn't count or something. Gross. Dude, he's my brother. This was all just really weirding me out at this point. But basically, this huge essay was a lengthy excuse to just guilt-trip me and explain why he was going to be rude to me in the community going forward. I didn't want that, so as polite as I could put it, I sent him a message saying that this was all a little much for me and crossed many of my boundaries, and I wasn't comfortable having someone around me or my friends who'd behave this way towards me, so I think I'm going to have to remove him from the server and ban him. I asked him to confirm that he'd seen the message with a thumbs up and then blocked him. And now, fast forward to a year. I was hiring for a small indie game my friend was working on, and I was helping him out as an art director and scouting for talent for the role. I put out a call on various platforms looking for people to help him out, and one really stood out. Their CV said that they were a 23-year-old non-binary Austrian femme-presenting artist, and their work was genuinely fantastic, really damn good art, and they were local, which meant that they could come into our co-working space for an in-person interview. Wonderful, I thought. My friend would be thrilled, and so was I. I emailed back and forth with this artist who agreed a date and time to come in and meet with me. It was just me in the office that day because the game director got called away on some urgent business. There was a knock on the door and a person entered. I checked the time and yeah, this should have been my meeting with the artist. Now, I'm not trying to be judgmental about people's appearances. If they say they're femme-presenting and maybe don't quite fit what I picture as femme-presenting, okay. But when the 23-year-old non-binary femme-presenting artist looks, sounds, and is dressed like a 43-year-old balding, bearded man from Milwaukee, even I have my limits. He wore a Guns N' Roses t-shirt that stretched at the seams over his hairy beer gut. He looked like Kyle Gass from Tenacious D if he'd gained 100 pounds, lived in a van for 6 months, and hadn't showered. He smelled like it too. And he just sort of strides in, closed the door behind him, and I didn't notice it, but he locked it, and took a seat on the other side of my desk uninvited. I asked him if I could help him, and he said he was Amelie, the artist here about the job. Of course, alarm bells were ringing, so I say, "You're a 23-year-old Austrian person," and he nodded and said yes in a very obviously American accent. What the hell should I do? I was terrified of being slapped by some discrimination lawsuit or something, but this chunky-ass bearded man clearly was not a 23-year-old Austrian femme. Then I noticed a tattoo on his wrist. It was the stick figure from the Blair Witch Project, and a sinking feeling suddenly washed over me. I'd never seen him in person back in the day, but he had sent a photo of his Blair Witch tattoo. Yeah, you've already worked out who this is, right? Rustin. He saw me looking at the tattoo and was, well, I guess the jig was up. And so I asked him straight up, did he catfish me as an Austrian femme in her 20s just to meet me? Rustin then leans towards me and said that he knew once I saw him and we made eye contact, I'd realize that we were soulmates. That the connection would unlock something in me, and I'd no longer be broken in the ways that I was, and the power of our connection would fix me. I was furious, so I stood up and stormed to the door and attempted to leave, and that's when I realized that he'd locked it. Luckily, it was just one of those catches that you flick, but as I was trying to unlock it, Rustin was up on his feet and grabbing me. He pulled me away from the door, surprisingly gently, and whispered in my ear that as soon as I felt him against me, as soon as our bodies touched, I'd understand. Let's just say it was one of the scariest and least pleasant experiences of my life. There certainly was no awakening. If I'd been arrow-aced before, then Rustin's touch had somehow sent my romance interest into the negative figures. I told him that no, sorry, I didn't feel it, and if he didn't let go of me right the frick now, he was going to feel something very unwelcome. I was absolutely trembling and shaking with fear, and my threat squeaked out like a mouse on helium, so I don't think it threatened him very much. I did get a burst of strength, though, because the idea of this repulsive, evil Father Christmas doing something unspeakable to me was just too much. I fumbled for the door lock while also banging on it, screaming for help, hoping some of the other people who used the co-working spaces were in the office that day. The security guy on the door had been around at least because someone had let Rustin up, and I managed to get the door open and fled, with Rustin thundering behind me. Now, for a big man, he was fast, although it sounded like he was really physically struggling. We were on the 4th floor of this rented co-working space, so I had the genius idea to run down the stairs. I was pretty fit, and he was not, so maybe this would slow him down. I underestimated his determination, though, because by the time I reached the 3rd floor, still calling for help, it sounded like Rustin was getting closer, if anything. I decided to turn and risk looking back, and that's when I saw him sort of leap or fall. I don't know. He just sort of flung himself belly first down the stairs towards me, maybe trying to land on me like John Cena on meth or something. Unfortunately, I sidestepped that, and he bounced against the wall and then stumbled at the top of the stairs. And then this guy bounced, tumbled, and fell down 2 flights of stairs, screeching and yowling in pain the entire time. Now, despite myself, I was kind of worried that he was going to actually break his neck, so I ended up chasing down after him just in time to see him face-plant on the floor. And then suddenly, other people showed up, bursting in through the stairwell door asking what the hell was going on because they thought they heard a noise. I told building security everything, who then called the cops. Rustin was not in good shape. He ended up having some broken ribs, a broken arm, and worst of all, his Guns N' Roses t-shirt had split from throat to sternum, and I'm pretty sure that was a genuine 80s artifact. Now anyway, it was kind of hard to get any crime to really stick on him. He'd only mildly assaulted me, which I did press charges for, and it was enough to get a restraining order against him too, but I think the amount of people who told him that they'd make sure his life wasn't worth living if he came after me again was enough to keep him away. Hopefully he no longer thinks we're soulmates, and I can tell you one thing. Being grabbed by that guy most certainly did not change my mind on having no desire to date. So I'm a grown woman who still gets scared listening to your stories like a little kid. Now, I won't share my exact age, but I'm old enough that when this happened to my mom, the term catfishing didn't even exist, and wouldn't for a good few decades after this. So the way she tells it, she got the wool pulled over her eyes, so to speak. I don't know if you use that expression in the States, but it comes from, I really have no bloody clue actually. I guess covering someone's face with a sweater, and maybe a smart aleck in the comments can tell us. So back when my mom was an eligible bachelorette in the 1960s, a friend of hers called Sandy convinced her to go on a date with this guy. She said he was a right catch, easy on the eyes and loose with the wallet, if you get what I mean. Not only that, but he was a burgeoning player in the up-and-coming London movie scene. We all know the UK's put out some absolute banger movies like The Full Monty, Mean Times, and of course, Psycho. Now, Mum's friend Sandy was making all these hints that Mr. Hot Poop Director, who we'll just call Ron, had some connections to Alfred Hitchcock, the legendary filmmaker that was his mentor or something, and he was looking for a leading lady who Sandy thought sounded a lot like Mum. Mom fancied herself as a bit of an actress. She'd done some school plays and even been in the panto at the church hall a couple of times, which in those days was basically like being Hollywood royalty. Now, back in those days, Mum was sweet on a guy named Simon, so she was a bit reluctant to agree to this date with director Ron, but Sandy was insistent. And that's how it worked in Hollywood, apparently. He wouldn't expect anything from her, just a polite and friendly dinner date, because who ever heard of a Hollywood executive behaving poorly with women? I mean, let's not even get started on the fact that this wasn't Hollywood. It was London, but you get the point. Now anyway, Mum decided that she'd go for it and would simply not tell Simon and hope that he understood when she explained how she'd gotten her big break and was about to become a star, etc. She got all dolled up. I've seen the photos. She looked classy, like you genuinely could believe that she was at the Oscars with how stylish she looked. And when she got out of the taxi at the restaurant that she'd been told to meet Ron at, though, I think her Hollywood dreams began to melt away. I guess calling it a restaurant is very generous here. It was more... Now, if you've ever been to London, you'll know the kind of outfits I mean. Dark, dingy, poky little restaurants that stink of cigar smoke, with carpets stickier than a Velcro shoe. And as soon as she entered, a guy parked at a table in the back waved her over. She knew immediately this was her date. Mom wasn't sure who or what she'd been picturing with Ron. Sandy had made him sound like Roger Moore, but also warned Mom not to get her hopes up too high in the looks department. But then followed this up with a wink implying that he did have the looks to back up his reputation. Heck, I think at this point, Mom would have been happy with a younger-looking Alfred Hitchcock, or anyone who wasn't Ron, really. And the way Mom tells it, Ron was like some kind of comic book character, and not in a good way. He was 5 foot tall and thin as a rake, and somehow had a beer gut on him that would rival Oliver Reed in his heyday. And then he had this huge, long nose above, and Mom swears this is true, a mustache that he could absolutely in no way be unaware looked like a certain Austrian painter's. Immediately, in her mind, Mom started thinking of Ron as Hitchcock, based on his huge nose and resemblance to a certain dictator mixed together. But this made her start laughing at her own little joke as she sat down. I guess Ron, hereby known to the rest of us now as Hitchcock too, because if I have to think of it, so do you all, must have said something he intended to be funny because he beamed a smile so wide and wolfish that Mom could have sworn that he was ready to eat her. He had these yellow, crooked teeth too, although Mom says that back then that was fairly normal for working-class lads in London. Hitchcock was supposed to be some movie bigwig, though, so she expected him to have teeth that were at least within the vicinity of white, though. They sat down, and Hitchcock ordered a bottle of the cheapest wine on the menu, giving Mom a look like he'd just ordered luxury champagne. And then he began rabbiting on about the movies that he was going to make and how he was going to be huge and how difficult it was to get studios to back him and that they just didn't understand his vision. But with a lass like Mom as the third member of the team, they couldn't fail. Third member, Mom asks. Hitchcock makes a big display of pulling out an old-fashioned pocket watch and says, yeah, Ron should be here any minute now. Mom's suddenly confused and wrong-footed. Are you not Ron? She asks. And Hitchcock hoots with laughter and explains that no, he's not Ron. In fact, he's Gary. Gary Reed, the producer, and he'll be sitting on Mom's date with Ron just to see how things play out and what the chemistry is like. Now Mom's absolutely confused at this point. Sandy had led her to believe that this was a date with a guy called Ron, who was both a romantic catch and as an actress. Now the guy dressed like a 2-bit Hollywood phony is there claiming he's not even Ron in the first place. Oh, here she is, Hitchcock blurts out and turns to where the bell above the door just rang. Now in struts, well, I only wish Mom had a camera phone back then. She describes Ronnie, like this. Imagine Mira Hindley was a drag queen, but a woman dressed up as a woman dressed up as a woman and also the blueprint for the predatory lesbian trope. Oh, and she had a perm like Mira's too. Except for some reason only the left half of her hair had taken and the right half was flat and limp. Oh, how I wish I could have seen this woman for myself. But alas, I wasn't even an egg at this time. Now let's read, Joel, if you ever feel like hosting a fan art competition and anyone wants to have a shot at drawing Ronnie, it would make my bloody day. I still search the internet to this day to somehow try and find the slightest possibility of a photo to see if Mom really did her justice. Ronnie slumps down in her chair, commands Hitchcock to order her 2 beers, and then waits in silence as they're delivered. She downs one without pause for breath and then just belches, and then turns to Mom. Christ, you're a hot little bint, aren't you? She says, apparently. Mom's a little taken aback. Ronnie introduces herself as Ronnie. Mom jokes like Ronnie from the Cray twins, and Ronnie stares at her as if looks could kill and asks if she looks like a bloody man. And Mom has no idea what to say because despite obviously being a woman, Ronnie did indeed look rather like a gay man. Then she laughs and squeezes Mom's hand and is all like, don't worry, darling, you can call me whatever you want, as long as you call me. And it's Cray. like Kreigh. Mum just nods, totally taken aback. So, Hitchcock says that he'll let the two ladies get on with it. This is just a screen test, as they both know, and they just need to act out a romantic meal between two forbidden lesbian lovers. He explained that Mum's character, Scarlett Letitia, comes from a wealthy plantation owner family, and Ronnie's character, Fanny O'Bannon, is the daughter of a feared London gangster. Mum's all like, so if I'm the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner, is my character supposed to be American? Hitchcock looks genuinely baffled at this, like he hasn't really thought about it, and then just waves his hand away, saying the plot doesn't really matter. So for the next 30 minutes, Mum and Ronnie order the grimiest spaghetti carbonara known to man, and sit there eating it and ad-libbing small talk while Hitchcock occasionally tells them to sexy it up and get a bit more touchy-feely. Now, Mum has always been a pretty liberal lass, but that didn't extend to being felt up by a mysterious lesbian, so she was a little against this. Furthermore, she was starting to feel extremely duped by both Sandy and Hitchcock, so she asked Hitchcock exactly how he knew Sandy. Mum was friends with Sandy through the typing pool that they both worked at for a bank or something. Hitchcock laughs and says Sandy's his niece, and he's always hooking him up with available women for his movies. Mum is starting to lose her patience here, so she slams her fork down and asks Hitchcock and Ronnie to explain exactly what the hell the movie is about and why she has to sexily eat spaghetti as a screen test, which had no cameras present, she adds. Ronnie says something along the lines of, "You poor, sweet summer child. It's a grotty movie, a dirty film. Surely you knew that. This district of London is basically known for its adult industry." No. My dear, sweet mother had not known that, and she got up to leave. Hitchcock stopped her in her tracks. He reminded her that it was only girl-on-girl adult film, so it wasn't really like doing it at all, and the camera equipment that they had was so crap that hardly anyone would be able to tell that it was her. And understandably, Mum wasn't convinced. Then Hitchcock pulled out the check. He said, "Maybe this will change your mind." And he even did that eyebrow wiggle thing, like he was making her an offer she couldn't refuse. £10 to star in an hour-long piece of grot with a woman who may or may not be the female doppelganger of Ronnie Kreigh, overseen by a man who looked like the Italian version of the Austrian painter. Mum just laughed, stood up and thanked them for their time, and began to walk to the door. Hitchcock began chasing her, trying to give her every excuse under the sun as to why she should stay. Mum glanced back over her shoulder, and she swears that she saw a look of screwed resignation on Ronnie's face. And just then, the door to the restaurant opens, and 3 smartly dressed men in suits enter. Now, these were exactly the type of men that Mum had been led to believe Leonard Hitchcock was. They looked her up and down, nodded approvingly to each other, and one of them asked Hitchcock if this was the talent they were investing in and had been promised. Mum said that actually she was just leaving, but wished them luck with their movie. The older, heavy-set guy of the 3 just looks at Hitchcock and says, "Not again, mate. You're not screwing us yet again." And the younger man, in a white suit with a gentle smile, takes Mum aside and asks her exactly what they promised her. She explains that she's been kind of duped into coming on this date, and then forced to eat spaghetti with a predatory lesbian while Hitchcock watched. Mum was not the type of woman to be shy or intimidated by London hardnuts. She'd grown up around them. And the guy in the white suit told her that his name was Jimmy, and everything would be fine. In fact, he'd walk her to the bus if she wanted, and even give her a lift home because he had his car nearby. Either way, he said he thought that it was better if they maybe left right now because a few more of the boys were showing up in a minute. And in fact, they did, nodding hello to Jimmy like he was some bigwig, even though they were twice his age. As the door jingled shut behind Mum, the crashing and smashing and shouting started. Mum, ever the curiosity-killed-the-cat type, tried to turn back and look inside to see what was going on, but Jimmy gently but firmly guided her away and said that she seemed like far too nice a woman to star in Leonard's grot movies, and definitely too nice to see what was going on inside the Stag and Ferret right now. Ronnie came bursting out the door, running on one heel, hooting with laughter and yelling to Mom that it had been nice to meet her, so that made Mom feel a bit better. "Don't worry," Jimmy said. "Nobody's going to get killed over a crappy adult movie. Just some lessons going to be taught after all." And the gleam in his eyes and the kindness in his voice was what let Mom allow him to give her a lift back to hers. And she mostly ends the story there, but when she tells us kids anyway, she adds that, as we're probably aware, she invited Jimmy up for coffee. The story of Jimmy is its own whole other tale. He's my dad and the father of my 2 older siblings, but not my younger sister. He's lived a very interesting life, but I would say an honorable one, and ultimately I feel like if Mom hadn't been catfished into almost starring in that movie, I probably wouldn't have been born. Jimmy, I've never called him Dad, weirdly enough, is one of my best friends, and we have all manner of bizarre stories like that, but I don't think any of them are quite as scary as the time, before I was even a twinkle in Mom or Jimmy's eye, that mini dictator and Mira Hindley almost got my mum killed in a London gangster bar brawl. Oh, and as a side note, Mum did eventually end up meeting the real Ronnie Cray shortly before he was sent down, and she says that he was much more polite and much more civilized than the Ronnie Cray that she almost starred in that film with. So I guess that's nice. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations, and I release new ones every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the real rapture is November 12th, 2025.